the unexpected tribute. The night before the grand event in New Delhi was unusually quiet. Sundar Pichai sat alone on the balcony of his hotel suite, staring at the city lights below. His hands were clasped tightly and his eyes were lost somewhere far away. Tomorrow was supposed to be a celebration of technology, innovation, and India's growing influence on the global stage. But for Sundar, it was something far more personal. Deep in his heart, he sensed that the moment awaiting him would stir emotions he had kept buried for years. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, memories began to flood his mind like a gentle but unstoppable wave. He remembered his childhood home in Chennai, the modest rooms, the smell of freshly cooked food from the kitchen, and the warm smile of his mother, Lakshmi Pichai. She had always been the quiet force in the background, the person who encouraged him when things felt impossible, the one who taught him that kindness was more powerful than ambition. His father, a humble engineer, had laid the foundation for his dreams, but it was his mother's strength that shaped his heart. Earlier that day, he had received a message from the event organizers. They told him that Prime Minister Narendra Modi would make a special tribute during the ceremony. They didn't give details, but their tone carried a sense of gravity. Sundar had been honored many times before. He had received awards, stood on global stages, and been celebrated as a symbol of success. But this felt different. Something about the way they mentioned the tribute unsettled him. Was it about Google's achievements? Was it about India's technological future? Or was it something personal? His wife Anjali gently placed a hand on his shoulder and asked if he was nervous. Sundar smiled faintly and shook his head. But deep down he knew he wasn't nervous about the speech he had to give. He was nervous about what he might feel. Over the years he had trained himself to stay composed in public, to keep emotions tucked away behind a calm smile, but memories of his mother had a way of piercing through every wall he built. When dawn broke, the hotel came alive with quiet activity. Security teams moved through the hallways. Event planners whispered into their earpieces and camera crews checked their equipment. Sundar got ready slowly, buttoning his shirt with deliberate care as if each button connected him not just to the day ahead, but to the story of his past. Before stepping out, he looked at a framed photograph he always carried when traveling. It was a picture of his parents on the day he left for Stanford. His mother's eyes had been wet with pride and worry, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as if to say, "Go chase your dreams, but never forget where you came from." As the car made its way through the crowded streets toward the venue, Sundar noticed the faces of people gathered outside. Some waved, some held banners with his name, and others simply stared with admiration. He had become a figure of inspiration for millions, but he often reminded himself that he was just a boy from Chennai who once shared a single telephone line with the entire neighborhood. Humility was not a performance for him. It was his foundation. Inside the grand auditorium, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. World leaders, industry pioneers, students, and journalists filled the seats. Large screens displayed moments from Sundar's journey, his first day at Google, his appointment as CEO, and milestones that changed the digital landscape. But as he walked backstage, he overheard two senior officials talking in hushed tones. "When the Prime Minister speaks about her," one of them said, "it's going to be emotional." The other nodded. "He wants the nation to know her story." Sundar stopped for a second, his heartbeat quickening. "Her," he whispered to himself. A sudden realization struck him and his chest tightened. Were they talking about his mother? But how could they possibly know the personal moments that shaped their family's life? He had spoken of her occasionally in interviews, mentioning her support, her resilience, but he had never shared the most intimate chapters of her journey. Minutes before the event began, Sundar was escorted to a private waiting room behind the stage. A soft light filled the space and the muffled sound of the audience drifted in through the walls. He sat in silence, hands resting on his knees, breathing slowly. This was no ordinary keynote. Something was coming. Something that would bring the world's attention not just to him, but to the woman whose quiet sacrifices had made his path possible. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Prime Minister of India." The audience erupted in applause as Narendra Modi walked to the podium. Sundar stood just behind the curtain, watching the live feed on a monitor. Modi began his speech by talking about India's young innovators, the rise of technology, and the inspiring journeys of individuals who carried India's spirit across the world. Then his tone softened and his eyes seemed to search the crowd with a kind of warmth that silenced the room. "There are stories," he said slowly, "that go beyond success, stories of silent strength, of unseen hands that lift others to greatness. Today, before we honor one of India's brightest minds, we must pay tribute to someone whose name may not appear in the headlines, but whose presence shaped history in its own quiet way. Sundar leaned closer to the monitor. His palms grew slightly damp. His heart beat faster. Not because of the lights or the crowd, but because in that moment he knew exactly who Modi was about to speak of. The air felt heavier, as if the entire hall held its breath. And then Modi uttered the words that made Sundar's world stand still. Today, we honor Lakshmi Pichai. The room erupted into a collective gasp, and Sundar felt something deep inside him tremble. His throat tightened, his eyes stung, and for a brief moment the calm, composed leader the world knew vanished, replaced by the son of a woman whose legacy was finally being acknowledged on the grandest stage. But what Modi said next would reveal a truth Sundar had never shared publicly, and it would change the way the world saw his journey forever. The story the world never heard? The auditorium fell into a deep silence, the kind that wrapped itself around every soul in the room. Sundar stood behind the curtain, frozen, his breath caught halfway in his chest. He had imagined many moments in his life, receiving awards, delivering speeches, leading global projects, but nothing prepared him for this. Hearing his mother's name spoken with reverence by the leader of his homeland stirred emotions that were both overwhelming and raw. It felt as if time had folded, connecting the humble kitchen in Chennai with the grand stage of New Delhi. Modi's voice grew softer, carrying a kind of weight that made every word echo. Many of you know Sundar Pichai, he said, but not many know about the quiet resilience of Lakshmi Pichai, the woman who stood behind him like an unshakable pillar. In a time when opportunities were scarce and traditions held strong, she made choices that shaped not only her son's future, but also the path for countless dreamers who came after him. As these words flowed through the hall, Sundar's eyes glistened. Memories of his mother working late at night came rushing back. He remembered the soft glow of the kerosene lamp, the rhythmic sound of her sewing machine, and her gentle voice humming old songs as she worked tirelessly to support the family. She was not just a mother. She was the heart of the house, the quiet architect of their future. Modi continued, Lakshmi Pichai was not a woman of fame or wealth. She lived a simple life, but within that simplicity lay extraordinary strength. When Sundar received his admission letter to Stanford, their family faced a difficult decision. They did not have the money for the airfare, nor the savings to support his education abroad. But Lakshmi refused to let that dream fade. She sold her cherished gold bangles, heirlooms passed down for generations without telling anyone. She wanted her son to fly without the weight of worry. She said, dreams must not be trapped by fear. The audience gasped softly. Some wiped their eyes. Others exchanged glances filled with admiration. Sundar stood still, but inside him something cracked open. He had known the sacrifice, of course, but hearing it spoken in front of thousands, broadcast to millions, gave it a new life. It wasn't just a family story anymore. It was a legacy. He remembered the night she had made that decision. It had been raining heavily. He had walked into the living room to find her sitting quietly with a small box in her lap. She smiled when she saw him, hiding the faint sadness in her eyes. Go, she had whispered. The world is waiting for you. He didn't know then that inside that box were the bangles she had once promised to give to her daughter-in-law. She never mentioned it again. Not once, even when the family's financial situation grew tight. She simply carried on, her heart steady and her faith unshaken. Modi's speech deepened. Lakshmi believed that education was a bridge between struggle and opportunity. She never stepped onto that bridge herself, but she built it brick by brick for her children. Her story is not written in textbooks, but it lives in every young Indian who dares to dream. As these words echoed, Sundar's vision blurred slightly. He had spent years representing Google on the world stage, speaking of innovation and technology, but he realized that the most powerful story he carried was not about algorithms or devices. It was about a mother's unspoken courage. He felt his throat tighten, but he straightened his posture. He had to walk out soon, face the crowd, and speak. But how could he speak when his heart was trembling like this? The camera shifted to capture his entrance. A stage assistant touched his arm gently, signaling it was time. Sundar inhaled slowly, wiped the corner of his eye discreetly, and stepped out into the light. The applause was thunderous, but it felt distant to him. His mind was still in Chennai, standing beside his mother as she quietly shaped his destiny. When he reached the podium, Modi turned toward him and gave a warm, knowing smile. It was not the smile of a politician, but of a man honoring something sacred. Sundar bowed his head slightly in gratitude. As the applause died down, Modi placed his hand on Sundar's shoulder and said into the microphone, "Today we don't just honor a leader of technology, we honor the son of Lakshmi Pichai." Those words broke through Sundar's practiced composure. He felt his chest tighten, and his voice wavered as he began his speech. "Thank you," he whispered softly, pausing to gather himself. The audience leaned in, sensing the depth of what was unfolding. "My mother," he continued, "never sought recognition. She believed in quiet strength. Everything I have done, every step I have taken carries her fingerprints. Her lessons were not in textbooks. They were in the way she lived, the way she gave without asking for anything in return." His voice grew steadier as he spoke, but his heart felt heavier with every word. He had kept these emotions locked away for years, always moving forward, always carrying responsibilities. But now, under the lights, with the world watching, those walls began to fall. As he looked at the sea of faces, he noticed something unusual. In the front row, seated among dignitaries, was an elderly woman wearing a simple white sari with a soft border. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her eyes were fixed on him. For a split second, Sundar's breath caught. The woman looked strikingly similar to his mother. The resemblance was so strong that his mind stumbled between memory and reality. Who was she? How did she end up in the front row? And why did her eyes hold the same kind of gentle strength that his mother's had? Before Sundar could make sense of it, the lights shifted again and the announcer called for a special presentation that was not on the official schedule. Sundar exchanged a confused glance with one of the organizers. Something unexpected was about to happen. The elderly woman slowly stood up and the cameras turned toward her. The room fell silent once more, and Sundar felt a strange shiver run through him. The woman in the white sari. For a moment, Sundar wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him. The lights from the stage were bright and warm, but everything else around him blurred as his eyes focused on the elderly woman in the front row. She stood calmly, her white sari glowing softly under the stage lights, her posture upright yet humble, and her eyes fixed on him with a kind of quiet intensity. Something about the way she held herself reminded him of his mother when she was determined, graceful but unshakable. Sundar felt a sudden rush of emotions rise in his chest, a mix of confusion, longing, and disbelief. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing that something unusual was happening. This was not part of the planned ceremony. Cameras turned toward the woman, capturing her every movement. Reporters whispered to one another, curious about this unscheduled moment. The Prime Minister stepped slightly aside, watching with interest. Sundar stood frozen at the podium, unsure whether to speak or wait. The elderly woman slowly began walking toward the stage. Each step echoed softly in the vast hall, but for Sundar, it sounded like the heartbeat of a distant memory. As she climbed the small set of stairs leading to the stage, event organizers exchanged puzzled glances. This wasn't rehearsed, yet no one stopped her. There was something about her presence that commanded quiet respect. Sundar watched her approach, his pulse quickening. When she reached the top, she paused, looking at him with eyes that carried decades of untold stories. Then, in a voice both soft and steady, she spoke into the microphone offered by one of the staff members. "I am not here to speak of technology," she said slowly, her Tamil accent wrapping gently around each word. "I am here to speak of a promise." The room fell completely silent. Sundar's eyebrows furrowed slightly. A promise? He took a small step toward her, trying to understand who she was and why she was here. Her voice carried a calm authority that held everyone's attention. "Many years ago," she continued, "in a small neighborhood in Chennai, a young woman came to me late one night. She was worried, but she was also determined. She placed a small box on my table and said, 'Keep this safe for me. If my son ever forgets where he came from, give this to him. It will remind him of who he is.' That woman was Lakshmi Pichai." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Sundar's eyes widened. He remembered that night faintly, but he never knew what his mother had done afterward. She had told him she was handling something important, but she never explained. The elderly woman reached into the cloth bag she carried and slowly pulled out a small wooden box, darkened by time but carefully preserved. Sundar recognized it instantly. It was the same box his mother had once held close to her chest on the night before he left for America. He had always assumed she had sold everything inside to pay for his journey, but clearly she had kept something aside. His heart pounded against his ribs. The woman walked toward him and placed the box gently in his hands. Her eyes met his, and in that gaze, Sundar saw a lifetime of quiet guardianship. "She trusted me to keep this," the woman said softly. She said her son's journey would take him far, but she also believed one day destiny would bring this box back to him when he needed it most. Sundar held the box with trembling hands. The wood felt warm, as if it carried the memories of his childhood. He could almost smell the faint scent of jasmine that used to fill their house every morning. He hadn't felt this close to his mother in years. The weight of the box was not heavy, but it carried emotions that pressed deep into his chest. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing the silent tears forming in his eyes. For a man known for his composed demeanor, this was a rare and deeply human moment. He stepped back from the podium slightly, opening the box slowly, unsure of what he would find. Inside, wrapped in a piece of soft fabric, lay a handwritten letter and a small gold chain with a tiny pendant shaped like a diya, the traditional oil lamp. The letter was written in Tamil, the handwriting neat but slightly faded with time. Sundar recognized it immediately. It was his mother's handwriting. A sharp ache rose in his throat. He traced the first few lines with his finger as if touching the words would bring her back. He began to read silently. The letter spoke of love, hope, and reminders to stay grounded. She wrote about the values she hoped he would carry with him: humility, respect for every person, and the importance of kindness over ambition. One line stood out, written with slightly darker ink as if she had pressed harder while writing it. "When the world celebrates your success, remember to bow your head to the hands that lifted you." Sundar's vision blurred again as he read those words. It felt as though she were speaking directly to him from somewhere beyond time. The woman in the white sari stepped closer and gently touched his arm. "She knew this day would come," she whispered. "She told me, when he has everything, he will need to be reminded of where it began." Sundar nodded slowly, unable to speak. The audience was spellbound, many wiping their eyes. It was no longer just an event. It had become a living story of love, sacrifice, and the invisible threads that tie generations together. But just as Sundar tried to compose himself, one of the organizers rushed onto the stage and whispered something urgently into the ear of the master of ceremonies. The announcer's face grew tense. Sundar noticed the sudden change in energy around the stage. Security personnel began to move quietly toward the left wing. Something was happening behind the scenes, something that was not part of the emotional tribute. The announcer took the microphone and, with a controlled tone, said, "We ask everyone to remain seated. There has been an unexpected situation, and we will handle it with calm." The lights dimmed slightly and a quiet unease spread through the hall. Sundar tightened his grip on the box, his mind shifting from emotion to concern. The elderly woman turned to him and whispered, "This is not over yet." Her voice carried a strange certainty that made his heart race again. Sundar looked at her, puzzled, but before he could ask anything, the curtains on the left side of the stage stirred violently, and a tall man in a dark suit appeared, flanked by two security guards. His presence was sharp and commanding, and he seemed to know Sundar. Their eyes met, and in that moment Sundar's expression changed from confusion to shock. The man from the past, the tall man in the dark suit, stood at the edge of the stage like a shadow cutting through the light. The security guards flanking him whispered rapidly into their earpieces, but the man raised his hand calmly, signaling them to step back. His presence carried a strange mix of authority and familiarity, the kind that made Sundar's heart beat unevenly. The audience, sensing the shift in atmosphere, grew quiet once more. Even the Prime Minister watched intently, unsure of what was unfolding. Sundar kept his eyes fixed on the man, gripping the small wooden box tightly against his chest, as if it were a shield against the unexpected. The man walked forward slowly, his footsteps echoing on the polished stage floor. The elderly woman in the white sari turned her gaze toward him, her face tightening with recognition. Sundar noticed the flicker in her eyes. She knew who he was. That realization sent a chill through him. The man stopped a few feet away from Sundar, and for a brief moment silence filled the space between them, heavy and charged. "It's been a long time," the man said softly, his Tamil accent unmistakable. Sundar's breath caught in his throat. He knew that voice. It belonged to Raman, his mother's younger brother, his uncle. Memories from his childhood flashed like fragments of an old film. Raman had once been a constant presence in their home, bringing stories, laughter, and wisdom. But after a series of painful misunderstandings about family responsibilities and financial struggles, he had disappeared from their lives without a trace. Sundar had not seen him since he was a teenager. The audience had no idea who this man was, but they could sense something personal was happening on stage. Sundar took a cautious step forward, his voice low and unsteady. "Uncle?" he whispered. Raman nodded slowly, his eyes softening for a moment before hardening again with the weight of years. "Yes, Sundar. I wasn't sure if you'd remember me after all this time, but I remember every moment." The elderly woman spoke suddenly, her voice firm. "Raman, why now?" There was a sharpness in her tone that caught everyone off guard. Raman turned toward her with a look that mixed pain and resolve. "Because, Undi," he said, "the promise wasn't hers alone. I was part of it too." His words struck Sundar like a sudden gust of wind. "What do you mean?" Sundar asked, his voice trembling slightly. Raman stepped closer, his gaze fixed firmly on Sundar. "Your mother didn't just give me the box," he said. "She made me swear something that night. She told me if he ever forgets the value of humility, remind him. If he ever stands on a stage where the world bows to him, make sure he remembers to bow first." The weight of those words settled over Sundar like a quiet storm. He had spent years trying to stay grounded, but hearing his mother's message spoken by someone from his past made it feel sharper, almost confrontational. The box in his hand suddenly felt heavier, as if it carried expectations far greater than he had imagined. Raman's presence wasn't just symbolic. It was a test, a living reminder of the values that had shaped Sundar's journey. Raman's eyes softened slightly as he looked at the box. "She told me to keep my distance," he continued, "because she wanted you to build your path without interference. But she also believed that one day, the world would celebrate you, and on that day, someone from the past must stand before you, not as a fan, not as a leader, but as family to remind you where you began." Sundar felt his throat tighten. His uncle's words carried both love and challenge. It wasn't anger, but it wasn't simple admiration either. It was something deeper, a mirror held up to his soul. "I never forgot," Sundar whispered. "I carried her lessons every step of the way." Raman's expression softened. "I know," he said quietly. "I watched from afar. I saw you rise. I saw you speak to the world, and every time I heard her voice in yours. But today, standing here seeing this tribute, I realized it's time you heard something she never told you." The audience leaned forward, captivated by the intimacy of the moment. Even the officials had stopped moving, letting the stage become a living family story. Sundar's hands tightened around the box, and he nodded slowly. "Tell me," he said. Raman glanced briefly at the elderly woman before looking back at Sundar. His eyes held both sorrow and pride. "Your mother had a dream," he began slowly. "Not just for you, but for the children of the neighborhood. She wanted to build a small learning center in Chennai, a place where no child would be turned away for lack of money. She started saving quietly, teaching children after her household work, collecting books from anyone willing to donate. When you left for America, she told me if he succeeds, this dream must not die." Sundar's heart clenched. He had known his mother's kindness, but he had never known the depth of her vision. She hadn't just supported his journey. She had quietly planted seeds for others. Raman took a deep breath. She couldn't finish it before she passed, but she left something for it, something only you can unlock. The box you hold is more than a reminder. It contains the key to her unfinished dream. The hall filled with soft murmurs. Sundar's mind spun as he processed this revelation. He looked down at the box, then at his uncle. Raman stepped closer, placing a hand on Sundar's shoulder. She didn't build that center because she wanted her name remembered. She wanted every child who walked through its doors to believe they mattered. Now that dream rests with you. Sundar's eyes filled with quiet tears, not from sadness alone, but from the weight of legacy. The event that had started as a public tribute was becoming something far more personal and transformative. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a sudden sharp sound interrupted the moment. It was the faint but clear crackle of a microphone somewhere off stage, followed by a male voice speaking rapidly in Tamil. The words were hurried, urgent, and unsettling. Security guards turned their heads toward the back entrance. Raman's expression darkened. Sundar recognized the tone. It wasn't part of the program. Something unexpected was unfolding outside the auditorium. The announcer stepped forward nervously, whispering into his earpiece. The lights flickered for a brief second and the audience shifted uneasily. Raman's eyes met Sundar's, and in that glance, there was both reassurance and warning. "She trusted you to finish what she started," he said firmly. "But you must be ready. This day holds more than you think. Before Sundar could respond, one of the guards rushed to the stage and whispered something urgent to the Prime Minister. Modi's face grew serious. A low murmur rippled through the hall. The announcer grabbed the microphone and with a strained voice said, "We ask everyone to remain calm. We are handling the situation." The lights dimmed slightly once again and Sundar instinctively clutched the box closer to his heart. This day, which began as a tribute, was turning into something layered with family secrets, legacy, and now, unforeseen tension. The storm behind the curtain, the sudden crackle of the microphone left the entire auditorium in uneasy silence. Sundar glanced toward the side stage where security officers were gathering near the backstage entrance. Their faces were tense, their movements sharp and deliberate. Something serious was happening behind those curtains. Something that wasn't part of any carefully planned tribute. The Prime Minister exchanged quiet but urgent words with his security chief. While the announcer tried to keep the audience calm, Sundar stood in the center of the stage, clutching the wooden box against his chest like a fragile treasure caught in the middle of a storm. Raman stepped closer to him, his expression no longer soft with nostalgia but firm with quiet alertness. "This is no ordinary interruption," he whispered. The elderly woman in the white sari nodded slightly, her eyes narrowing toward the shadows behind the curtain. It was as if both of them knew something that Sundar didn't. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, mixing the emotional gravity of his mother's legacy with the unsettling sense that something larger was at play. One of the senior event coordinators hurried onto the stage and leaned close to Sundar, speaking in a low, hurried tone. "There's a disturbance outside," he said. "A group of people has gathered unexpectedly. They're holding signs with your name and your mother's name. They say they have documents. They're asking to speak directly to you." Sundar's eyebrows furrowed. "Documents?" he asked softly. The coordinator nodded, visibly nervous. "They claim it's related to Lakshmi Pichai's old land and the unfinished learning center project." A cold shiver ran through Sundar. His mind flashed back to his uncle's words just moments earlier, about his mother's dream of building a learning center for the children of the neighborhood. He had only just learned about it, but now, strangers outside seemed to know something about it too. Raman's expression darkened. "I knew this day would come," he murmured. Sundar turned to him sharply. "What do you mean?" Raman hesitated for a moment, then sighed heavily. "Your mother's dream was not just a vision. She began it. She bought a small plot of land through modest savings and community support. But after she passed away, disputes arose. Some claimed rights over that land. Others wanted to turn it into something else. For years I tried to protect it quietly, but when you became who you are, the story of that land spread. People saw opportunity, both noble and selfish." The elderly woman stepped forward, her voice steady. Some supported the idea of preserving it as a learning center, but others saw profit. The land became more valuable over the years. What started as a dream turned into a battle, and now it seems that battle has followed you here. Her words struck Sundar like a distant echo of his mother's struggles. Lakshmi Pichai had faced challenges quietly, solving problems with grace and persistence, but now her unfulfilled dream was stirring storms she could no longer calm herself. The Prime Minister's security team informed Modi about the situation in detail. Modi turned toward Sundar and gave him a gentle nod, signaling that he could decide whether to address the gathering or continue the ceremony. Sundar stood silently, his mind racing. He had come to this stage prepared to give a keynote about technology, innovation, and India's digital future. Instead, he found himself holding a box filled with his mother's memories, standing beside family he hadn't seen in decades, and facing a crowd outside carrying the weight of her unfinished promise. He took a deep breath, the kind that comes from deep inside the soul, and whispered to himself, "Amma, guide me." Then he turned to Raman and the elderly woman. "If they're here because of her dream, I need to face them," he said firmly. Raman nodded slowly, pride flickering in his eyes. "Then do it the way she would have done it," he replied, with humility, not fear. The organizers quickly adjusted the stage. Large screens outside the venue were connected to the stage feed, so the people gathered outside could see and hear Sundar. The curtains at the back were drawn open slightly, to allow a clear line of communication. Sundar stepped toward the edge of the stage, his hand still holding the wooden box. The murmurs outside grew louder as the crowd realized he was about to address them directly. On the screens, Sundar could see the faces of the people gathered. Some were elderly, carrying signs with faded photographs of his mother. Others were younger, holding documents and handwritten placards. One sign read, "Don't let her dream die." Another said, "The center belongs to the children." The sight of those words made Sundar's chest tighten. He had spent his adult life in boardrooms, product launches, and global events. But here, in his home country, he was being pulled back to the essence of his beginnings, the values his mother had quietly lived by. He lifted the microphone, his voice soft but clear. "I see you," he began. "I hear you, and I remember her." The crowd fell silent as his words traveled through the speakers. "My mother believed that knowledge belonged to everyone," he continued. "She worked silently for something bigger than herself. I only learned the full story today here on this stage, and I stand before you not as a CEO, but as her son." A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd. Some began to cry softly. Others raised their hands in quiet support. Sundar's eyes moved across the crowd and then stopped suddenly. Near the front of the gathering, a young woman stepped forward, holding a thin folder close to her chest. She looked nervous but determined. Security moved to block her, but she raised her hand and shouted, "I'm her student. I studied under Lakshmi Pichai when I was a child. I have something she left behind." Her voice carried through the speakers and struck Sundar like a lightning bolt. The crowd parted slightly to let her step forward. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her stance was steady. She held up the folder and said, "She gave this to my father and told him, 'If my son ever returns to build this center, give this to him. This is the blueprint.'" The words hung in the air like a spark about to ignite something larger. Sundar's hands trembled slightly as he nodded for the guards to let her approach. The folder looked worn but carefully preserved, tied with a faded red ribbon. As she walked toward the stage, the cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail. The crowd outside grew restless with anticipation. Sundar extended his hand slowly, ready to receive something that might hold the final piece of his mother's vision. But just as the young woman reached the edge of the stage, a sharp sound pierced the air. A loud metallic clang from the side gate outside, followed by hurried shouts. Security officers turned their attention away for a split second. The screens flickered. In that moment of confusion, the red ribbon around the folder came loose, and a few papers fluttered into the air, carried by the sudden gust of wind. Among those papers was something unexpected. A legal document with signatures, seals, and a date that made Raman's face go pale. He reached forward instinctively and whispered to Sundar, "This changes everything." The promise fulfilled. The papers danced in the air like fragments of forgotten history before slowly settling on the ground. Sundar knelt down and picked up the document that had landed closest to his feet. The texture was worn, the ink slightly faded, but the seal at the bottom was still clear. As he scanned the first few lines, his heart began to pound in his chest. It was a legal deed, dated more than 2 decades ago, bearing his mother's name, the plot number, and a carefully handwritten note at the end in Tamil. The note read, "This land is entrusted to the children of the community. It shall never be sold, only used for learning." Beneath it was her signature, steady and full of purpose. Raman stepped closer, his face pale but determined. "She registered this quietly," he whispered. "No one knew except a handful of people. After she passed, some tried to challenge it, but they couldn't find the original deed. We thought it was lost forever." His voice trembled slightly as he continued. This is her final word, legally and morally." Sundar stared at the paper, feeling a wave of emotion surge through him. Everything around him blurred, the cameras, the crowd, the stage lights, until only his mother's handwriting filled his vision. He could almost hear her gentle voice, the same one that used to wake him in the mornings, telling him to keep his feet grounded even as he dreamed big. For years he had carried her teachings in his heart, but this document made them tangible. It wasn't just a memory now. It was a responsibility written in ink. The young woman who had brought the folder stood nervously at the edge of the stage, unsure if she had done the right thing. Sundar turned toward her with soft eyes and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said gently. "You carried her dream when none of us knew." She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "She believed you'd come back one day," she whispered. "She told us that the day she wouldn't return, her son would." Outside, the crowd grew louder, not with anger, but with hope. Chants rose softly, almost rhythmically, calling for the learning center to be built. Sundar stood up slowly, the document in one hand and the wooden box in the other. The weight of both felt different now. One held memories, the other held destiny. He walked back to the podium, his steps deliberate and calm. The entire hall had fallen silent, waiting for him to speak. The Prime Minister watched him closely, understanding that this moment had shifted from a ceremonial tribute to something far more meaningful. Sundar placed the document in the box gently on the podium and looked at the crowd both inside and outside. His voice was steady, but there was a soft tremor of emotion beneath it. "My mother," he began, "lived her life quietly. She never stood on a stage like this. She never asked for applause. But she built dreams not with speeches but with sacrifices. This paper is proof that her dreams were never just for me. They were for all of you." The crowd erupted in applause, but Sundar lifted his hand gently to quiet them. "I have spent my life working to bring technology to people," he continued. "But today, I am reminded that the most powerful things are not built by technology alone. They are built by love, community, and purpose. This land belongs to the children, and today I promise in her name that the learning center she dreamed of will finally be built." The elderly woman in the white sari pressed her hands together in quiet gratitude. Raman's eyes filled with tears, his stern demeanor melting into relief. The young woman in the front bowed her head, overwhelmed. Outside, the crowd began to cheer louder, their voices merging into one unified cry. Sundar closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling the warmth of that sound. It wasn't the applause of admirers. It was the heartbeat of a community finally heard. He opened the letter from the wooden box one last time and read the final line aloud, letting his mother's words echo through the hall. "When the world celebrates your success," he read slowly, "remember to bow your head to the hands that lifted you." His voice broke slightly on the last word, and he lowered his head. The crowd stood as one in silence following his gesture. It was not just respect. It was a collective bow to the legacy of Lakshmi Pichai. The Prime Minister stepped forward and placed a hand on Sundar's shoulder. "Today," he said into the microphone, "we don't just celebrate a leader in technology. We celebrate a son who honored his mother's dream." The cameras captured the moment, broadcasting it to millions. But for Sundar, the world outside didn't matter at that instant. All he could think about was the small kitchen in Chennai, the kerosene lamp, the sewing machine, and the quiet strength of a woman who believed in education more than anything else. As the ceremony ended, Sundar walked down from the stage and approached the young woman who had brought the folder. He knelt slightly to her level and said softly, "You were her student. Now you will help me build this center, together." She nodded through her tears, unable to speak.